My name is Tiffany, and I currently live with my husband, Andrew. I am 45 years old now, but I went through a divorce with my previous husband when I was 40. The reason for that divorce was essentially because I reluctantly accepted my previous husband's unilateral desire to divorce. Since we had no children together and I didn't have a good impression of my previous husband, I saw it as a fortunate opportunity and agreed to the divorce. However, during that time, my previous husband said to me, "Who would want a leftover woman at 40? You'll just spend the rest of your life alone and miserable. Oh, and since I've been supporting you up until now, there's no need for any division of assets, right? To think a woman abandoned by me could end up so pitiful." His mocking words completely dried up any feelings I had for him. I was ashamed to have spent so many years with such a man. Yet, sometimes remembering his words spurred me on, determined not to end up as he said. While living with my previous husband, Scott, I hardly wore makeup because he would say, "Makeup is just a waste." I only wore the bare minimum for work. Now that I'm in an environment where no one complains about what cosmetics I buy, I've started to buy makeup and go to beauty salons to regain my sense of self. Looking back, Scott, despite us both working, acted as if he was the only one earning and forced all household chores on me, acting superior. I was not fond of Scott, but having lost my parents early and with no relatives to speak of, he was the only one I could rely on in times of need. Well, even if I had collapsed from overwork, Scott would probably have just scoffed and abandoned me. Regardless, not wanting to be alone, I stayed by Scott's side for many years. Scott knew I wouldn't leave, which probably encouraged him to take me for granted and order me around as he pleased. And when he got bored of me, he left me. However, his predictions did not come true. I am now married to Andrew, whom I met 2 years ago, and am walking through my second life with him. Andrew is 2 years older than me. I heard that he hadn't remarried since his previous wife passed away from illness. He showed me a photo of his late wife, who was very beautiful and looked nothing like me. When I asked Andrew why he married me, someone who looks nothing like her, he said, if she resembled my late wife, it would just remind me of her. I'd feel like I'm betraying her. That made sense. Thus, he decided to marry someone completely different from his late wife. Knowing that it wasn't just because I didn't resemble his late wife that he chose me, I wasn't upset. Andrew and I met at a marriage matchmaking party for people over 40. I spoke with various people, but I didn't find anyone particularly enjoyable to talk to. After speaking with a few men, getting lectured about their beliefs, or being told they didn't like aged women, I was exhausted. It seemed to me that the reason these people weren't married was exactly because of their off-putting attitudes. I wanted to retort that they were of similar age when they complained about women being old. Eventually, while sitting in a corner of the venue, Andrew came and sat near me on a bench in the same corner. "Are you tired?" Yes, a bit. It's quite exhausting to talk with so many people here." I agree. "I'm a bit tired myself. This seems like a good spot to take a break." Andrew mentioned he was running a company and had struggled with its management. Since his wife passed away, he hadn't remarried until now. There seemed to be many women attracted to the title of company owner. Even when Andrew sat near me, women came from the center of the venue to approach him. Then, Andrew said, "I'm currently speaking with this lady, so please do not disturb us." With a smile, effectively turning the woman away. After a moment, I realized he was referring to me. Andrew apologized to me, saying, "I'm sorry if it seemed like I was using you." But I understood his concerns, so I told him, "Feel free to use me as much as you want." Then, he laughed with surprise. After that, we shared our stories. Why we were attending a matchmaking party, and why I had been divorced by my previous husband, Scott. I also mentioned that I was looking for a partner because I didn't want to prove my ex-husband right. But it's kind of strange to be looking for a life partner with such a mindset, isn't it? It could be a nuisance to the other person. Really, participating in a matchmaking party with such an impure motive. Then, how about using me? What? Andrew smiled warmly at me. There's nothing wrong with getting married for competitive reasons. I realized at some point how lonely being alone made me feel. And I started looking for someone to marry. If you say your motive is impure, then mine is impure too. While thinking that not wanting to be alone isn't necessarily an impure motive. I laughed, appreciating his attempt to encourage me. I see. Is it okay if I use you, then? Of course. I think you still don't know much about me. So how about we start with dinner together? That sounds like a great idea. After the matchmaking party, we went to his favorite Italian restaurant. The pasta he recommended was delicious. Andrew looked pleased as I happily enjoyed the meal. We met several times after that. Andrew had married his previous wife when he was 20. It was a marriage while he was still a student. Shortly after graduating and finding employment, he started his own business. But around the same time, his wife fell ill and passed away. To forget his sorrow, Andrew threw himself into his work. As a result, he remained unmarried until now. Of course, I explained to him why I ended up divorced. Though my explanation was vague because I didn't fully understand why Scott suddenly wanted a divorce. I can't understand someone who would disregard and just throw away someone like you. But, as odd as it might sound, it was lucky for me that you got divorced. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to meet you. His words made me blush unexpectedly. I hadn't anticipated being told something like that. Being with Andrew made me feel like I was in love again, something I thought wouldn't happen again. It didn't take long for Andrew and me to get married. Our marriage has been very smooth. After marrying Andrew, I quit my job to focus on hobbies I had always been passionate about. Andrew told me when we got married, if you like your job, you can continue. I want you to prioritize what you want to do most. So, I quit my job to make the most of my life. Andrew praised me a lot as I diligently pursued my hobbies and took care of daily chores. He said, I used to rely on housekeeping services. But coming home to someone cooking is such a joy. And your cooking is delicious. He enjoyed my cooking with happiness. One day, while Andrew and I were out on a weekend, we were talking in a cafe when Andrew received a work call and excused himself from the table. As I waited for him, I suddenly heard someone say, "Isn't that Tiffany? What are you doing here, following me around?" I looked around and saw my ex-husband, Scott, in the aisle next to our table. Next to him was a young woman I didn't recognize, clinging to his arm. Seeing the young woman clinging to Scott, I thought to myself, it must be hard to walk with someone clinging to you like that. Scott, smirking at me, said, "You're still alone, aren't you? For a woman dumped by me to come to such a fancy cafe. You might spend a month's worth of food money here, right? Maybe you entered this cafe planning to dine and dash. That's not true at all. I intend to pay for my visit here." Even years after our divorce, Scott hasn't changed much from when he decided to leave me. His personality is as bad as ever, and he continues to mock me. Seeing the woman with him behaving this way, I couldn't help but think she was misguided too. But I responded to him calmly without showing any irritation. I wonder. After all, I dumped you because you were poor. While drinking my coffee, I listened to Scott. I didn't want to be ridiculed by him any further. But I was curious about the reasons he had for initiating our divorce. Having Andrew as a wonderful husband now, I felt confident in myself regardless of what Scott said. "When you were living with me, you couldn't earn much, could you?" I always wondered how you could earn so little. What do you mean? Scott and I both had jobs. I've seen his salary slips before, and as far as I could tell, there wasn't much difference between our earnings. I couldn't understand why he thought my earnings were low. But he boldly stated, "What I mean is, I dumped you because your annual income was $10,000. You don't understand that?" I was dumbfounded. As I was surprised, the woman listening to our conversation giggled and said, "Poor people deserve to be dumped." I understood they were mocking me, but their insult was based on a misunderstanding. Huh? That's the monthly rent, though. Both of them looked puzzled at my words. It seemed Scott had made a huge mistake. Well, thanks to that mistake, I was able to divorce him and marry Andrew, a wonderful husband. I told you when we got married, didn't I? I have rental income. That income was $10,000. Not from rental income. My salary from work was about the same as yours. Scott was gaping in disbelief at my words. The woman beside him, not understanding, asked Scott, "What's rental income?" Scott was too shocked to answer, so I explained to the woman in his place. "I'm a landlord. I own apartments and buildings. And I collect rent from the tenants every month. That income is $10,000. And I also had a salary from my job back then." Huh? So you were earning more than Scotty? Scotty must be Scott. I wonder if he enjoys being called that by the young woman. Well, it's no longer my concern. Yes, that's right. The salary I received from our company was about the same as his. So, Scott dumped his ex-wife, calling her poor? That seems to be the case. The woman looked suspiciously at Scott, who, realizing he was being scrutinized, hastily said, No, that's not it. I dumped you because I couldn't stand your deterioration. You used to be beautiful, but you stopped trying to look good after we got married." It seemed he wanted to blame something other than financial reasons for the divorce. I sighed. "I didn't stop trying to look beautiful. You were the one who forbade me from buying cosmetics. You also banned me from going to the salon. And even required your permission for me to get a haircut. How could I possibly maintain my beauty under those conditions? You wouldn't even let me take proper care of my skin." Ew. A guy who controls what cosmetics you buy is the worst. The young woman, now a few steps away from Scott. Apparently, Scott hadn't remarried yet. Had the woman been his wife, she would have known his true nature sooner. Lucky for her, she discovered it before marrying him. No, that's not true. I said you shouldn't wear makeup because you might cheat. Wearing makeup and going out means you want to show it to other men, right? Before I could respond, the young woman exclaimed in disbelief, as if makeup isn't for men, it's for me. Don't flatter yourself. It's awful to think that way. What era's mindset do you have? Stay away from me. Goodbye. It seemed she had had enough. Furious, she left Scott behind and quickly exited the cafe. I really wished Scott would leave soon. He was becoming a disturbance to the shop. As I started to drink my coffee again, perhaps panicked from being abandoned by the woman, he blurted out something outrageous to me. Then, "Let's get back together." What? I was astounded. Just because he was rejected by the woman didn't mean he could simply propose to reconcile with me. I was already happily married to Andrew. And I had never once considered getting back together with Scott. However, Scott smirked, "You've been alone since we divorced, right? Living a lonely life? So, I'm offering to console you." I was dumbfounded. Before I could respond, I noticed Andrew, who had finished his phone call, standing behind Scott with an angry expression. "Do you need something from my wife?" Scott turned around in shock upon hearing Andrew's deep voice from behind. Wife? Yes, she is my cherished wife. Quite bold of you to hit on another man's wife. What? But she was my wife. Tiffany divorced her previous husband a long time ago. She is now in a marital relationship with me. You have no rights over a woman like Tiffany, whom you disparaged and discarded. We were enjoying a day out as a couple. You, being an outsider, should leave immediately. Scott was visibly flustered by Andrew's words. He had assumed I was still alone, but that was not the case. Feeling like I had triumphed over him gave me a sense of satisfaction. Then, Andrew stared intently at Scott, who seemed too intimidated by Andrew to move. Eventually, Andrew began. Now that I think about it, you're the person who came to our company for a sales pitch, aren't you? What? Could it be the president? It appeared that Scott and Andrew had already met before, through work-related circumstances. Yes. I said we would consider whether to sign a contract with your company. But we will pass on making a contract with your company. A company that sends representatives who demean women in public is not one we can feel comfortable making a deal with. No, please. My sales have been falling recently. I don't have any options left. Please sign the contract. Andrew dodged Scott's attempt to plead further. Today is my day off. Could we not talk about work now? If you intend to continue bothering me and my wife, I will call the police. The mention of the police, and perhaps the realization that further pestering would only exacerbate his situation, led Scott to leave dejectedly. After sending Scott away, Andrew seemed a bit down, saying, "It's all because I was on a work call." But then brightened up. "You really saved me at just the right moment." He smiled happily. Later, I learned that Andrew had decided not to sign a contract with Scott's company. There were other companies offering similar terms. So he chose to make a deal with one of them instead. Somehow, the company found out about the unpleasant encounter with their employee during the president's day off, and Scott was relegated to a less influential position. Knowing that Scott is probably leading a lonely life still gives me a sense of relief.